Okay, where were we?
So let's start from the beginning.
Where were we? When we arrived in Palestine?
Well, how did you get there in the first place?
How did we get there?
Mm-hmm.
We got from Poland on a train to Romania to a place called Constanza, the port city on the Black Sea, and then we took a ship going through the Black Sea, through the Dardanelles and the Sea of Marmara, and down the coast to Jaffa.
Do you remember?
Well, vaguely, very vaguely.
How can you remember?
I don't know, very vaguely. But we went through that procedure twice or three times.
Ah.
So I guess the more recent times probably are more vivid, but it was the same kind of thing. And then
Well, how old were you at that time?
well, the first time was I think I was between a year and a half and 2 years old.
A year and a half and two. So what year? We're talking 1930?
1923.
I mean, yeah, no, sorry.
24, beginning of 24, something like that. That's when we came to Palestine.
And why? Why'd you go there?
Well, my parents were Zionists, and they didn't believe in Jews living in Europe under anti-Semitic conditions, especially Poland was very anti-Semitic at that time. And they believed that, you know, the vision of Theodor Herzl reviving the homeland of the Jews in Palestine was important to them. They wanted to live in a country where they were free to do whatever they wanted. Well, the pioneering spirit at that time was that Jews must return to manual labor, which they were forced to how would I say? They were forced not to do in the ghettos of Eastern Europe because they weren't allowed to own land. If you don't allow to own land, then you can't till the land. So the only manual labor that they did was in the service industries and in the crafts, the arts and crafts. And there were so many Jews were tailors and cobblers and jewelers and watchmakers, that kind of thing. And another thing that was open to them was to go into business. So they went into business in many places and did quite well, especially after the emancipation in Europe, the Napoleonic Wars. Poland became Poland, and they owed their independence to Napoleon, and to this day they remember that, even in their national anthem. And so the Jews, the Jews ostensibly were free by then, but they still remained in the traditional Jewish occupations, and they did well in business, of course. You know, when you're in business, you do better than other people usually if you're talented. And so they did that, and they started getting into the professions. Now some of the professional schools started opening up, but on a very, very quota system and a gentleman's agreement that you don't take in Jews. And so that's the situation was that the Jews felt, at least the progressive Jews, with the advent of socialism and those progressive ideas, they felt that Zionism was the thing to be. And Zionism was a kind of a national socialism. I mean, it was an idea of the Jews coming back to their country with these socialistic ideals, which was the main branch of Zionism. Later on there was another branch of Zionism called the revisionists, led by Jabotinsky, who they weren't socialists, and they were more militant. They said that Zionism should express itself into conquering the land by force, and Jews becoming military and all that kind of stuff. Well, all that thing blended together when the State of Israel was established. But we came around 1923 or 24, I don't know exactly, and of course my parents came to my mother's sister on the kibbutz, that she was one of the founders, and they stayed there for about a year or two. It wasn't for them. My mother didn't quite take all this labor, you know, that the women were into, because a lot of the women went to agricultural labor. My mother wasn't that strong physically. And my father had a good craft because he was a master craftsman, from German trained in ironworks and metal and machinery.
Where did he study?
So,
Where did he study that?
He studied at that thing in a German school. I don't remember if in Germany proper or in a German school established in Poland. That part of Poland where they came from and where I was born, the city of Łódź, Lodz. There were many. There was a big German community there, big German business community who were in the crafts and the higher crafts and the more how would I say, engineering type things. And they were also in the textile industry where the Jews gravitated to. So many of the Jews from Lodz were being called Lodz weavers. And they established quite a weaving tradition. As a matter of fact, my grandfather owned a big house with 2 yards. In the backyard was a dye works, D-Y-E, dye works for the thread,
Right.
for textile thread.
Oops. Sorry about that.
Used to bring in huge spools of thread. I visited there and I saw it. They were bringing in huge spools of thread on big platform drawn by 4 horse teams, and then they dipped those things into the vats of dye, and then they would come out and they would spin dry them and take them back to the factories where they were weaving the materials. In Eastern Europe it was quite common. In Poland they did all these cottons and wools. In Czechoslovakia, below them, they were famous for doing corduroys, fine corduroys and things like that. And it was many Jews, basically a big Jewish industry. And in Poland, the Jews were recognized after World War I as a national minority, just as Ukrainians and Lithuanians and Germans were recognized as national minorities, where they could actually have schools that the language of instructions were Polish, but they could also teach Hebrew. And the other minorities, the same thing. The language instruction was Polish for Polish citizens, but they could also teach their own languages like Ukrainian and Lithuanians and stuff like that. So that's a recognized national minorities. That tradition holds in many countries of Europe. Not in the United States, but in many countries of Europe it does. And so anyway, they migrated with the Zionist migration to Palestine in those days. I had an uncle in Palestine who was there since Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire. That's when he migrated, so he was one of the early Zionists. And then his sister came after him, who was my mother's senior by about a year and a half. And then, of course, the whole family kind of pulled each other together, and they all went into Palestine one by one. There were just a couple of sisters left in Poland. And so we had my mother had 3 brothers and 2 sisters in Israel.
What were their names?
And the name was Hela, was my mother's older sister by a year and a half. Sala, which is Sarah, was my mother's younger sister. Of course, my mother was Rivka or Rebecca, and she had a nickname called Ginia. And then there were 2 younger brothers, Abraham and Shmuel. And Shmuel, we called him Shmulik. And Abraham from Poland was called Bruno. Now I don't know why Bruno, because Abraham, maybe the last syllable was kind of formed into Bruno.
What was your dad's nickname?
My dad's nickname was Nunek.
Nunek, that's right.
Nunek. Yeah. His name was Israel. And in later years, everybody called him Israel. Maybe my mother just called him Nunek. But anyway, the ones who remained in Israel were all those except for Shmulik. Shmulik contracted tuberculosis as a very young fellow in his early 20s. Went back to Poland, to the family, because there was no treatment at that time in Palestine and nobody could take care of him. So he went up to Poland, and they set him up in a sanitarium up in the mountains there with the pine trees and the good air. But he only lasted till he was about 27 or 28, and he passed away from the disease. There was no cure at that time for tuberculosis. today tuberculosis is being taken care of by antibiotics. And my aunt Sala, well, my aunt Hela, my mother's older sister, was married to a fellow named Mordechai, which is Mordecai, and their last name was Ben Yehuda. And he was there since World War One. Okay? And they left a few cousins and children of cousins that we visit to this day. And the kibbutz was named Geva. My aunt Sala married a fellow by the name of Danieli, Yitzhak Danieli, and he worked as a retail salesman for the Shell company. He was selling kerosene to households, just driving a mule cart with a barrel of kerosene on it, like a tanker cart, pulled by a mule, and he used to ring a bell in his hand, and everybody knew that the neft was coming. Neft is from the word nafta, which is, N-A-P-H-T-A, which is Latin for petroleum. And the reason they used to distribute those things to the households because the households didn't have anything to cook on. There was no wood. The country is very poor in lumber, and there was no gas, and there was no electricity. Electricity, you were lucky if you had electricity if you lived in a modern house. Otherwise, everything was being the fuel was kerosene. And we had this primus, little almost like camp stoves, little round camp stoves that originally came from Sweden. And you filled them up with kerosene, and you primed them with a little alcohol, and the head started being warm, and you pumped them up, and it was like a blowtorch. And you cooked on that. And then besides that, you had another little appliance like this that you filled with kerosene, but it had a wick. And so there was slow burning, and if you needed something cooked slow or kept warm, you kept it on that one. So if you had a large family, you had a couple of those primuses. Like my mother had two primuses and one of these wick heating lamp. And you also, if you needed to heat your house, you also had a kerosene heater, which you had to keep the windows open to get it nicely vented, otherwise it smelled. All the lamps were old hurricane lamps with a wick with kerosene in it, until you got electricity. In more modern houses, you got electricity. And finally most everybody got electricity, so the hurricane lamps went out. But on the kibbutzim, they still had these big hurricane lamps. I mean, these big lamps that you had to pump up, like Coleman lamps, with what do they call them? Those little socks that you put on them. Those Coleman lamps. What would you call these?
Mantles.
Mantles, yeah. Coleman lamps with mantles that used to burn out, and you had to replace them. But these used to be huge. The brand was called Lux, L-U-X, and they used to hang them from the ceiling, and this is how you ate in large halls. But in the kibbutz, the fare was very poor, and they tried to sell everything they made, and whatever they couldn't sell, they ate. And so that's the way they existed. It was a very pioneering, hard work, no air conditioning, and very, very hard pioneering existence.
How many people were on the kibbutz at that time?
There were different. This Geva used to be called a kfutza, which was a small kibbutz. A kfutza means a group,
Mm-hmm.
and the kibbutz means a larger concentration of people. So they were a kfutza, and most of those kfutzot in Hebrew, in plural in Hebrew, were better off than the kibbutz. The kibbutz was a little more unwieldy, and the kfutza was a little more cooperative and a little more socialistic in its ideals.
How many people would you say?
I would say maybe 60 to 100 people altogether, the whole families.
Right. And were they all did they all people that knew each other from Lodz, or?
No, they were not people from the same place. The original immigration, the core of the original immigration were Russian Jews. And you could still hear a lot of Russian spoken.
How did they come together? How did they meet each other?
Well, they used to belong to organizations, youth organizations in Russia and Poland. And then they little by little, as members or in groups of maybe 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, they immigrated to Palestine. And then in Palestine they got together in groups that were helped out by the Jewish National Fund. Jewish National Fund was a fund that Jews all over the world contributed by putting coins into tin boxes with a map of Palestine on it in blue and white colors, and it's called. It used to be called the Jewish National Fund box, and then these monies went to buy land from landowners in Palestine. Usually there were absentee Arab or Turkish landowners, and they would sell these lands, mostly lands that were not worked, and they were not arable. They were stony and rocky places, or marshes with a lot of malaria and stuff like that. And so they bought this out. So the big, I think today the big story about the Jews taking land from Arab peasants doesn't quite hold water. Maybe as a result of the wars, there was some displacement of the Arabs, but not before that. Before that, it was all bought, sold, and bought and registered, and then they settled on it and started working it. The flourishing Jewish farms and kibbutzim and so on, it engendered some jealousy from Arab villages, but by and large, there weren't any troubles. There was some thievery of crops and stuff like this, so they developed a system of defense, of ranging in the fields, where you had to go out at night and take your turn in guarding the fields, sometimes on horseback, sometimes on foot, and that's about it. There were some older settlements in Palestine. During the Ottoman Empire, there were Jewish settlers that came in under the auspices of Baron Hirsch from England and the Baron Rothschilds, who bought up large tracts of land and set up Jews on farms, actually like colonial farms, where they weren't Jewish workers at that time, because the Zionist movement wasn't as developed, so they had Arab workers working with them, and they were like colonial farmers, like Englishmen in Kenya or Zimbabwe or places like that. And they also developed the Rothschilds developed and taught them how to grow grapes, plant vineyards, and they started a wine industry, which the Rothschilds, of course, knew, as everybody knows. And so these were the old settlers, they used to call them, the old settlements. When the newer young Zionist pioneers came in with their socialist ideas, they weren't greeted as nicely by those old settlers. They're creating trouble. They are stirring up our Arab workers. They tell Arab workers they should be paid better and all that kind of stuff. Plus, they started competing. They wanted Jewish labor. They went to us and to the old farmers and demanded to hire them. And the old farmer says, well, if you want to work for the same wages as the Arab does, I'll hire you. Well, they would hire them, but they didn't know to work how the Arabs worked. The Arabs were natives, and they were used to the climate and used to the land and used to stoop labor, and the Jews weren't, so they had to learn, and they did. And this is what they used to call the conquest of labor. At that time, they say the conquest of labor. You conquered the country by labor. And so they started doing all the manual labor all by themselves, paving roads and building bridges and starting out farms and that kind of stuff. And that kind of stuff doesn't always go down well with the native population, even though you didn't take anything away from them. But they have neighbors who succeed so well, and they start resenting it a little bit. And I think during the Zionist settlement of Palestine, this is where Arab nationalism took its root, because there was no Arab nationalism before in Palestine. Palestine was just a province of the Ottoman Empire, and Arabs were Arabs, total Arabs. There was no such thing as a Palestinian Arab. They were these were the Syrian type of Arabs. They spoke this kind of a dialect all over Syria, Palestine, and Lebanon, and maybe even Iraq, as different from Egyptian dialect Arab. Egyptian Arabs who were Africans spoke a little different dialect of
And
Arabic.
Bedouins?
And the Bedouins were in the desert, and nobody really.
Like in Jordan, it's mostly made up of
Jordan,
Bedouins?
Jordan was at that time, under the Ottoman Empire, there was no Jordan. When Britain got the mandate to administer Palestine from the League of Nations after World War I, after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire and the Germans, they got a mandate over Palestine. Palestine was both sides of the Jordan. For political reasons later on, the British split the west side of the Jordan from the east side of the Jordan. They weren't allowed to do that, but they did it anyway. And they gave the east side of the Jordan to Abdullah. Abdullah was an emir of the house of the Hashemite dynasty. The Hashemite dynasty was defeated by the Saudis in Saudi Arabia in a power play.
Right.
So they got exiled to the north. But since they helped the Allies during World War I, you had to reward them somehow. So they rewarded the Emir Abdullah with the east part of the Jordan, and they were basically heads of Bedouin tribes. And the Bedouin call themselves the true Arabs. They don't call them. All right?
I think we better
Okay.
quit for now.